you can watch the stream of this event. I'm not sure exactly when you can start watching it, but in a day or two. Is that right, Chris? Yeah. Yes. So if you want to see it again, you can. So we pride ourselves on being able to attract some of the most excitingly talented people in the industry today, and tonight is no exception. We have once again a really talented, accomplished group of people, including 2 Oscar winners. I'm not going to do long introductions because they're there in the program. So please welcome, I'm going to start alphabetically, Lem Dobbs. Stephen Gaghan. David Seidler. And finally, our moderator, Dan Petrie Jr.
Thank you. I'm so glad to see so many of the same people back. How many people were here last time for our inaugural session? So by far the majority. And who's joining us for the first time for the first Notes on Craft tonight? A few people. So I should say that, you know, the Notes on Craft series attempts to talk about the kind of parts of speech of a screenplay, of a film, of writing a film in different segments. Obviously, they all overlap because you don't think of these things completely separately. But it's sometimes useful to try and deconstruct. You know, the people that were here last time or before know that I tend not to ask interview type questions like how did you get your start and who was your first agent, but to stay to the subject. And I encourage you, when it's time to do questions from the audience, to follow the same rule. You don't have to, but you know, I encourage that. Finally, when it's time to ask questions, I would ask you to wait for the microphone from questions from the audience, because we have a streaming audience. And if I take out my phone during the course of the evening, I don't mean to be rude. It's because I've invited people to tweet questions, and those are going to be relayed to me by some magical means of which I'm kind of unaware. But I trust that it's true. It's happened before, miraculously, and I'll believe it again. So, with that introduction, David, where do you start? Where do you start when you look at the whole canvas of a movie? Do you start with a character? Do you start with a scene? Do you start with a notion? Do you start with an outline? Where do you begin?
I start with the reason that I am writing this story. And the answer to that is not the check. Although sometimes that's helpful.
Is your microphone on?
Is my microphone on? I don't know. Your microphone is on. Okay. This is not the second presidential debates, I don't think. Okay, it's why did I connect with this story to begin with? That's always the most important thing. You know, you get offered material, and you look at it and you say, that will make a really great popular movie, and I don't want to write it. Mm-hmm. And you're offered other material and you say, gee, I would really love to go to see that movie, but I'll be seeing it in an empty movie house because I'm the only one who wants to see it. So very reluctantly you have to pass. And then there's material that comes along and you say, that resonates. There's something in there, and you may not even know what it is at first, that strikes a chord deep in your soul, and you say, I can write that story because I know about it. I know something in there. The next step is to discover what that is, because that's rather helpful. And that becomes what the movie is about. To me, that's really imperative. What is the movie about? Why am I writing this? And then comes a very expansive time of making. I usually make notes on 3x5 cards, and I pin them up on a big cork board if I happen to be fortunate enough to be in a place with a big cork board. And if not, they're on the living room floor. And the problem with that is you can't open the windows for 3 or 4 weeks because if the wind comes, your structure has disappeared, you see. But slowly these 3x5 cards magically seem to migrate into lumps. And the lumps are the beginning, the middle, and the end. I'm a writer, as most of you are here, from a Western culture that has really 3-part stories, beginning, middle, and that is not universal, of course. There are many ways of telling a story that are quite different, do not have a linear structure, do not have a beginning, middle, and an end, and we're beginning to experiment with a tree of life. Did not really have a beginning, middle, and an end, but it's a very interesting piece of work, so all the more power to it. But I write a more traditional type of story. I think that the unities kind of work. You can break the unities, and I love breaking the unities, but you have to know what the unities are first.
And the unities would include the 3-act structure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got very early on, my first job in this town was writing Tucker for Francis Ford Coppola. My second job in town was writing Days of Our Lives, so you understand how I did a trajectory. But Francis said, the thing you have to really put your mind to is, what is your last scene? What is your big last money scene? And then you start and you work towards it. And everything is moving towards that great climactic scene that makes the movie. And it was a piece of very, very good advice. Not necessarily advice I've always been able to follow, and nor has Francis, but it's really good advice.
Yeah. Stephen, how about you? Where do you start?
Well, it's different for me. I like that thing Coppola said. I've never done that. It's never even I wish I could think like that. It isn't like that. I'm usually rumbling around for long periods of time, doing nothing, and I do a lot of navel gazing, and I'm usually reading like 30 books at once, and none of them stick. Like I found a Turgenev biography next to my bed, and I was like, "Oh, I'll read that." And I got like 30 pages, and I was like, "I read that book." That just happened last week, and so that kind of thing's going on. And I think like during that process, there's just like a lot of also just sort of free-floating like self-loathing, of like you're useless and you'll never do anything again, and you don't have any talent. You never had, you got really lucky like once, and now you're just over, and and then that kind of goes on for like another 9 months, and then I run out of money, and I'm like, okay, muses, you better coalesce, like toot sweet. No, and then I'll be really specific. Like with Traffic, I had been working for a long time, and then I met Ed Zwick, and I told someone I wanted to do a satire on the war on drugs. Satire on the army, and I met Ed Zwick, and he said, let's do a satire on the war on drugs, and I was like, that's a better idea. I want to do that. And I knew I wanted to do that because at that point I had about 19 years of research in extracurricularly, and I was a real expert already. And I'm like, perfect. Syriana, I had been thinking a lot about capitalism and reading a lot about it, and just sort of thinking about it as a system. Is it fair? Is it not fair? Is it really a meritocracy? What does the government really do for us? You know, is there a true market economy anywhere in the world? And I'm thinking, well, you know, if there's a big pile of wealth over here that's like a mountain, then there's a hole in the ground over here that's about the size of that mountain, and it just gets moved around. It's a zero-sum game. And then they drove the planes into the World Trade Center, and I watched Bush's response, and I felt our foreign policy really shift radically. Like 50 years of foreign policy just got tossed, and I sort of felt like it was a ship that had been, you know, just like someone threw the wheel, and now we just like went that way. And I really wanted to do something on that. And then a little while later, I read this CIA biography by a guy named Bob Baer, and I said, oh, I don't want to do that, but I have this other idea. You know, lastly, like just as a weird example, so I guess what I'm saying is I'm having a lot of vague feelings that feel very important to me, but they haven't centered themselves around anything, a character, a story. You know, any of those things are helpful. I can start with a character, I can start with a story, I can start with an idea, I can start with a world, I can start with a book. Every book I've started with, I've thrown out everything, 100%. I've never used one beat or moment from any book I've adapted, so don't ever give me your book. And just finally, like I have this thing called The Candy Store I'm about to make, a movie I wrote. It's original. I did it with a friend of mine, and how that came about is I took a general meeting. Somebody said to me, what have you been thinking about lately? I'd had one idea, like in one sentence idea in the shower, which was somebody should really update Lethal Weapon. That's like a great idea. That could be a franchise, and people like franchises. You should do a franchise, Steve. That's a franchise. Update Lethal Weapon. So I said that. There was this pregnant pause, like 6 people in a room. They look at each other, arms folded, and they go, we're in. I'm like, so I said, I want to write it with my friend Shannon, who's a novelist, my best friend. I wanted him in the WGA, health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. It's great. And they go, great. So I tell him that. So we're going to update Lethal Weapon, blah, blah, blah. I got to do it this way, that way. I tell him how to do it. You got to do this. He starts working on beat sheets, sending me the note cards transcribed. And I'm like, that's terrible. That's not right. That's not right. That's not right. 6 months to that, and he finally says, have you ever seen Lethal Weapon? And I'm like, you should really lie here because you've referenced it so much. You should lie. But I couldn't. I said, no, I've never seen it. And he goes, you really ought to take a look at it. On to you, Lem.
Dude, you could have as easily said Beverly Hills Cop. I mean, you were this close.
I could have said Seven Samurai, and they would have all gone, we're not in, you know? And so I said Lethal Weapon, and 3.5 years later, I had a script.
Lem.
Same question?
Same question.
I suppose I've never lacked ideas. I lack the will to follow through with them. So I guess I start by, I'm always going through all my folders and all my projects and all my notes and all of my millions of ideas, and you sort of fiddle around with one and you start to despair and think, I can't do this. This one's too difficult. Or you get to the point where you have too many notes, and it becomes harder to sift through them all, and you just think, I want to start fresh with something, just with the blank page. I think the answer to the question is probably the old classical answer, which is that you write the thing that somehow rises to the surface, and you find it's the thing that's most compelling to you at that moment. I've always thought that being a writer was a way to not have a job, really, was to extend childhood play forever, for the rest of your life. So I think writing is a form of fantasy, and I think quite often I prefer to write original screenplays whenever I can. And I guess in some way everything that really works for me, or that I find that starts to flow, I'm indulging in some kind of fantasy, which is what the writing life allows you to do. You can enter into some other world. You can have whatever it is, a time travel fantasy or a sexual fantasy or anything you can think of. You can write it and live through the experience that way. So I think a lot of my original screenplays have, even if they're, even if it's a science fiction film or a fantasy or a western or whatever it is, there's some element of autobiographical interest in it that maybe is the starting point. But choosing the initial idea and thinking, we're working in this business where it's a constant balance between art and commerce. And you're constantly thinking, gosh, should I really spend the time to write this? Is there any market for it? And of course, the question becomes entirely different when you're offered work or you need a job. Quite often, too often, I think in my career, I've followed the Michael Caine theory of employment, which is whenever you feel the bank account needs topping up that week, you accept whatever's offered to you that week. And you try to invest your own personality into it and find something that you think you can bring something of yourself to. But it's difficult. There's a famous anecdote. I don't know if it's true. It sounds like a true story of the two greatest directors in England at the time, David Lean and Carol Reed. And they literally bumped into each other in the famous London bookshop Foyles. They were literally backed into each other and said, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And of course, they were both there looking at these shelves going up to the ceiling. And David Lean said, "Isn't it tragic? Somewhere here is our next film." You're constantly looking for something you just feel totally comfortable with that you think you can write successfully to the end instead of abandoning.
The opening question was really the topic of our last week's evening, which was on premise and concept. And I'd like to zoom past that to, we have our premise. Somehow we've gotten there. We've taken the assignment. We've said yes. We need the money. We are inspired. Whatever it is. And David, I'd like to zoom in on what you talked about with the 3x5 cards coalescing on the floor, somehow getting into 3 piles. I assume it's 3 piles because beginning, a middle, and an end. And I wanted you to expand on that. And then I'm going to ask the same kind of process question of our 2 other panelists.
Yeah, you've got to watch that middle pile, the second act. That's always the weak pile. It's a very... Let me deviate a little bit from your question, but it'll come back onto it. Mm-hmm. And it's not even about a feature film. It's about a TV series. But it is pertinent. I was asked a while back whether I would, by Barry Levinson, whether I would adapt Ron Chernow's Pulitzer Prize winning bio of George Washington. And I said, pass. And my agent said, "What do you mean pass?" I said, "Everyone thinks he's a stiff. He's got wooden teeth and he's on the dollar bill. And he says, 'I cannot tell a lie.' He was president of America. He couldn't tell a lie. Come on." It's part of the job. And I said, I really don't want to do it because I don't want to do a repeat of John Adams. It was done well, and I don't want to walk in their footprints. Telling a very respectful, linear story. It's of no interest to me. And again, agents being agents, he said, how can you turn down George Washington and Barry Levinson? They're on both sides of the dollar bill. Yeah. I said, well, I'm passing unless Barry would be interested in a different type of structure. And here we're getting back to structure. I didn't want to do the linear historic story. And so Barry said, "Okay, what's your idea, Seidler?" I said, well, I have always wanted to tell the story. Look, history is very strange. It's always written by the winners, but there are two sides of each story. And I've always been fascinated by telling the story of the American Revolution from the British point of view. Okay? This was a bunch of insurgents, a bunch of terrorists, led by a criminal who the Brits regarded the way we regard Osama bin Laden. And what always happens when a superpower goes to war, and Britain was the great superpower, they would form an intelligence committee to find out everything they can about the leader of the rebel insurgent army and then try to kill him. And by doing that structure, it allowed me to go back and forth in time. In other words, it's not just a linear progression of the Revolutionary War, but they're bringing in, say, Sally Fairfax, who he had an affair with, and who was married to his best friend, but she was in England, so they would be talking to her. They'd be talking to generals he had worked with during the French and Indian War, which he almost single-handedly started by allowing an Indian chief to hit the French diplomat with a tomahawk. Things like this. So it allowed a completely different type of structure. So now when I do my 3x5 cards, I realize it's a series, but it's really a big, big movie. The cards don't go into three neat piles of beginning, middle, and an end, but they go into thematic piles. So each episode will have a theme to it, shall we say. For example, fathers and sons. George Washington had a very tortured relationship with his stepson. He didn't have any children. Ben Franklin had a son who was the royal governor of Maryland, and when the American Revolution started, he assumed he would go with New Jersey, and he assumed he'd be a patriot, and the kid said, "Hell no, I'm for the king," and they had a falling out. These sort of things become different kind of piles. So the story and what you're trying to do with it often dictates the type of structure, which I think works fine, as opposed to a structure which delineates the story, which I think is a more problematic solution. Have I managed to avoid answering your question?
No, you did, Lem. We started the premise of the question was started with kind of what do you physically do when you structure something? Do you follow David's technique of taking 3x5 cards?
No.
Do you write a longhand outline?
I don't do the 3x5 cards, and I don't do outlines. I'm sorry to say I wing it most often. It's true that I think you need to have a goal in mind. You need to know your ending. But the paradox of that is that endings are so fragile and so vulnerable to change that even when they're not screwed up by the people who eventually make the film, it's sort of odd. I mean, the greatest screenplay ever written, Chinatown, the screenwriter Robert Towne had an entirely different idea about what the ending should be. He thought Chinatown should be a state of mind. Chinatown was a state of mind in the head of his character, and how lame it would be to actually literally go there. But the director obviously felt different. He thought that the character should go to the place that haunted him. Only by going physically to Chinatown could he face his demons and exercise his demons and have some kind of a life beyond the film. But again, you look at who the director was, Roman Polanski, who was reluctant to make that film because he didn't want to come back to Los Angeles and face his demons because of the horrible events that had happened the last time he had been in Los Angeles. But he did it, and he came back and he made the ultimate Los Angeles movie. So I think there's something to be said for facing your demons while you're writing the script. Even if someone changes your ending, it gives you a kind of integrity from beginning to end. Another great movie of the 70s, Deliverance, was the exact same war between the writer and the director in reverse. In that case, it was the writer who thought that the central character goes through this awful ordeal and initiation by fire, and comes out the other end stronger and more Hemingway-esque and macho and becomes a man and is able to then go back to his soft life in the city and sleep the sleep of the righteous and the just. And the director said, no. He's going to be haunted by this experience forevermore. He's going to wake up screaming every night, having nightmares about it. So you can write a great movie and a great story and have a very clear idea of what the ending is, and then someone can come along and shift the emphasis like that, and it can still work. But as the writer, initially, you do need to have that goal in mind. And I'm afraid I've always been wary of the 3-act structure. I think it's a conceit that comes, obviously, it's a theatrical term. And at the risk of giving offense, I hate theater. I hate plays. I hate them. I'm a child of the movies.
See you afterwards.
And I think I was reading. I'm supported in this. I just read about another screenwriter, marvelous, the late David Raphael, fantastic writer, and I was thrilled to see him say the same thing, that he feels that screenplays are more like novels than they are like plays. That like as in a novel, you have a starting point, and it's more of a narrative arc towards the goal at the end, rather than the 3-act structure, I've always felt. And I think it's certainly in the interest of screenwriting gurus to say, 3-act structure, because then they can draw charts and diagrams, and it seems like a mysterioso kind of secret formula that only the initiated can understand. And then, of course, you can sometimes simplify it and say all it means is beginning, middle, and end. But even beginning, middle, and end is sort of abstract. A different way of looking at it, which I read once, which I thought was marvelous, which wasn't even in reference to movies. It was in reference to a work of literature, which has always stuck with me, is that there are 3 parts to most movies. Most movies start with a question and answer it at the end. And certainly almost every really popular, successful movie does that. And the 3 parts that most movies fall into can be described as speculation at the beginning, some kind of question or speculation, that the middle part then interprets. So you have an interpretive, investigative middle part. And the ending is the discovery. And if you think about it, almost every genre you can think of falls into that pattern. It's why television relies so heavily on courtroom stories and medical stories, because you've got, here's the case, here's the trial, here's the verdict. Or here's the illness, here's the treatment, here's the result. And if you look at, is this ship unsinkable? Let's take it on its maiden voyage and interpret that question and find out at the end what happens when an iceberg hits it. Or is the house haunted? Let's spend a night in a haunted house, find out if there are ghosts, and arrive at that discovery. Is there a man-eating shark? Let's take a boat, let's try to find it. Oh, it's a man-eating shark, kill it, movie over. Almost every movie follows that pattern. Every love story, every romantic movie. Here are these 2 people. Are they going to end up together? The movie interprets their relationship, and you end with usually happily ever after, or some bittersweet, melancholy parting of the ways. Sports movies, is the guy a winner or a loser? The middle part is the training part or the assembling the team, and the discovery part at the end is winner, loser, score. But when I'm actually writing a script, it feels more like a 2-part endeavor. It feels more like climbing a mountain, like the Matterhorn. You pull yourself up to the peak, and then if you're lucky, by the time you get halfway through a script, you're feeling pretty good, and you can toboggan down the rest of the way. I think movies are more. I feel happier when I think of a movie in terms of two halves like that. It feels like balance, like a scales. And when you think of climbing Mount Everest, you might think that the climax is arriving at the summit. Oh my God, here we are. We're at the top of the world. But in reality, the climax of climbing Mount Everest is getting back down safely. Most climbers die on the way down because it's much more dangerous. And I think I like to think of a midpoint. I suppose it's quite often referred to as the turning point in a script, as the peak in the middle that you reach, and then you race to a climax.
I want to circle back to the because there are so many provocative ideas there about whether there is in fact a 3-act structure. Being just one of them. For now, I'll just observe that I thought you made a very eloquent case for the 3-act structure by accident. But to stay on the original question, Stephen, what's your physical process? The philosophy is one thing, but you're
often naked.
Yeah. I mean, do you do outlines? Do you do 3x5 cards? Do you structure?
I've tried it every way.
Actually,
I have a lot of thoughts on this one. First of all, your Washington idea is fucking great.
Yeah.
Like, I'm so bummed I didn't think of that. It's such a great idea. I mean, it's exactly the right way to do it. And he's an amazing character. That older wife he married for money. I mean, come on. You can have that. That's free. Okay, so I've written a bunch of things that are really massively complicated in structure. I don't know if you've ever seen any of them, but they are actually really complicated. And they're very complicated to put together, and they're very hard. It's very hard to arrive at that structure. I have tried to start winging it because that's fun, and I get lost. And I get so lost, and it's so painful. Secondary characters are like, Steve, come here. It's so fascinating. Like, there's a little door in the back of this room, and you can go through it, and there's an alley, and there's some more people you've never met. And they're way better than your protagonist, you're so sick of that guy. And that's a problem. And I want to really speak in defense of the 3-act structure for a second, because I think you have to be very, very good and very experienced to get rid of it. It took me a very long time to develop the reverence for it that I have, and I never, honestly, I know so little about this. I've had so little formal training. I literally just arrived at it by trying it. And the way I look at structure is I think of it as a house. Truly, like in my mind, it's like a thing that goes up in the air. That's my movie. It starts here, and it ends here. And inside that structure, which is a 3-dimensional structure in space, a story, or often in my case, multiple stories, are going like this. And I know they're going to end over here because the house is done. It's just this big structure. And maybe the other story is going like this, and they're crossing each other at these vectors, and the vectors are this way. And there's another one. But we're leaving out, for me, a very, very important thing, which is the power of the transition between one scene to another, which to me is the most important structural device that you have as an artist in this form, particularly as a screenwriter. You choose vividly where a scene ends and vividly where it begins. When you're writing your scenes, if you look on your page and you're just like dialogue and it's then a new scene that's dialogue, I think you've overlooked like the powerful tool. In fact, I've only seen one screenplay that ever worked, and it was a brilliant work of art. It was by Penelope Gilliatt, who wrote Bloody Sunday, and it is like that, and it actually is the exception, I think, that proves the rule. But what I do is, my process is I know it's going to start here and roughly end here, and I know these things are going to happen, and I have your thing of where I'm putting ideas. It's going to be here, maybe here, maybe here. Sometimes I have a corkboard. I had a 40-foot corkboard at once, and I'm putting these things, and I've used a 5-act structure and a 7-act structure, and I've used chapters, and I've used 3-act structure. The 3-act structure for me is by far the easiest and simplest. Even if I end up with 7 acts by accident, I start with 3, and I'll tell you why. Because, like he was saying, like for me, the first act is this. The second act is this. The third act is this. The big part in the middle is the hard part. Of the hard part, the by far the hardest part is this part. And of that part, much harder is this part. And the reason this part is so hard structurally, and it is hard structurally, and it's hard emotionally, it's hard thematically, it's because this is always in every story where all the themes that have been sometimes subtle and subtextual now coalesce, and they must be articulated for the audience. They always are. Even if you don't mean to do it, you will do it. And then you go forward into the third act, and things really are going to come to a conclusion somehow. And usually something really disastrous happens right at the end of this coalescing of the themes. And I've tried to avoid it, because the other thing I want to say, like David was saying, and I know Lem's work quite well, the minute I have an idea that hews to some form, I throw the form out, just like a punk. I'm like, I can't do that. I'm going to kill the movie star. I'm going to make the protagonist the people that are never the protagonists. I'm going to make the Pakistani migrant workers the people you care about. Then I'm going to kill them too. And then I'm going to kill George Clooney. I'm going to have 19 acts. None of them are going to make sense. And I'm just going to do it and fuck you. I'm doing it. So thank God for the 3-act structure, because it starts a little part here, 30-something pages, a big part here, 60-something pages, a little part here, 30-something pages. And in the middle, I know I'm always rising to what Lem referred to, what I call a mid-act. I don't really know what that is. I think I saw I read the introduction to a screenwriting book by Linda somebody, Seeger, a really long time ago. And in the introduction, it said, there's an inciting incident. And I was like, an inciting incident? That's such a good idea. Something happens. Wow, I should do that sometime. And then I saw something about the negation of the negation. I got very confused. I ignored that. But there was a mid-act, and I was like, that I understand. That's the middle point of the movie. So in my house, middle, and I always have this in my mind. I always know. Whenever I'm writing, I'm oriented in my head somewhere along this continuum. That's in theory. Then in practice, what happens is I bore myself to death, because the structure lends itself to retreads. Once you know, like in a love story, like Lem referenced, oh, the boy's going to meet the girl, the boy's going to lose the girl, the boy you think, then I don't want them to end up together. Like, period. I just don't. It's like how I'm wired. And so that drives my structural thinking. I work backwards by sort of dissolution. It's like a process of tearing it down. And but I would just say, whether you use corkboard and note cards, whether you wing it, you have to be very good to wing it. I mean, I have wasted years winging it, years before I finally admit defeat. And I get out those note cards of shame, and I put them up in their piles on the board, and I just go, all right, this is actually going to be a love story where a boy meets a girl, and I'll mess it up later.
This is epic. This conversation is so great. People ask me why I moderate these things obsessively year after year. It's because I learn so much, that I can steal. I can't wait. You mentioned script gurus, and that's there's a guy who has 22 building blocks of a screenplay, Are you familiar with this? 22 building blocks of a screenplay, and I thought of saying, not 23. You sure? Not 21. But of course, we should listen to him because he was the story editor of 21 Jump Street for almost a full season.
I love his work. I love it. He's so good.
There are, but among the people that you hear often, there is this concept of the midpoint that you talked about, and it seems to me that there's a lot of common sense behind that a first act is limited. It's 15 to 30 pages. So the third act is 15 to 30 pages at the far end. And so a second act in a conventionally structured American movie is an hour long. And there's got to be something. Do you consciously think of that when you structure a movie, or does that not even enter your mind?
Well, first of all, I have to admit I am someone who has never taken a course in screenwriting or any other kind of writing, and I've never read a book on it. I think there are some things that you can learn from books. Recipe books work really well. You can cook from a recipe book. There are other things like you cannot learn to fly cast from a book. You can't learn to ride a bicycle from a book. You have to do it. And with perhaps a nod to the Kama Sutra, sex isn't something you can really learn how to do from a book really well. You got to do it. You just have to do it. Thank goodness. And the same with writing. I'm an intuitive person. People think because I've got white hair, I'm an intellectual. I'm not intellectual at all. I'm purely intuitive. And so that's how I work at it. I see the midpoint as that wonderful moment when I know that from that moment on, the script is getting shorter and shorter and shorter till the end. This is great. I'm pedaling downhill now. And this is a wonderful feeling. So I'm really the wrong person to ask on this. I don't go by any formulas. I mean, I know something amazing is supposed to happen on page 20. Well, guess what? If it's really amazing and happens on page 28, it'll be just as good. Or if it happens on page 6, it'll be just as good. I don't believe if there were a magic formula that worked, everyone could do it.
Yeah.
Be real simple.
I meant to say, I forgot, I lost my train of thought earlier as usual, and I was talking about the transition between individual scenes, and in the structural discussion for me, like the thing that really happens, when I'm lucky, is that I know I've got a scene that's going to really work. Like, no matter what, this scene is going to be in the movie. And that's what I say. I'm like, I've got these scenes that no matter what, they're going to be in the movie. And I don't often know where they're going to be exactly. They're really good. I say, in my phraseology, I say they make their own weather. They just make their own weather. And, like, what happens is I get, like, maybe 5 or 6 of those or something. I'll look and I'll be like, wow, I'm going to put that one here. And in a way, it's just like almost a visual device. And suddenly, the transition between these two scenes, which is something I'd never even considered, it just blows my head off. I'm just like, whoa, that's amazing. And now I know, and maybe this might only be like 7 or 8 pages of writing. I'm like, that starts the movie. I don't even care about all this other stuff I have. I don't care. I will literally, now it's in media res. I had 30 pages. They're gone. And I don't even know what happens from here. And I will throw out I've thrown out 100 pages of a script many times. and but it's dictated by the energy that comes out of that transition. And it's, you know it when you see it, it's so strong. The Robert Bolt, Bolt scripted that great moment where in Lawrence of Arabia where the match is blown out and the sun's in the desert, So I just say to all you guys, there's the bar. Jump over it.
Yeah. Do you, that's not what I was going to ask at all.
Can I ask Lem something?
Yeah.
Lem, how can you hate an art form where the writers, if they change a comma, they have to ask your permission? I mean, this is the great thing about theater. So that's just a minor point, and we'll go on and we'll discuss the economy now.
I always think of Albert Brooks's first movie, Real Life, where he played a documentary filmmaker who goes to film a real family and their day-to-day, existence. And there's a scene where he's on the phone with his financier or producer, and the producer's saying, "But it's so boring. It's there's nothing's happening. There's no tension." And Albert Brooks says, "Nothing happening is tension. Haven't you ever been to the theater?"
Right. That should remind me of a joke, and it will. It used to be in my life that if something reminded me of a joke, it would remind me right then. Now it reminds me at 4 a.m. Famously, USC teaches an interesting form of structure called the sequence approach. Are you familiar with that, Lem? And because you
No, I've taught screenwriting at USC, and I have no idea what you're talking about. But
okay.
Well, in terms of, I always think of the famous E.M. Forster definition of story and plot is story asks the question what, and plot asks the question why. So a story is the king died and then the queen died. And the plot is the king died and then the queen died of grief. So plot deepens the story because you add cause and effect. And in terms of sequences, a story is merely just what happened. It's a series of incidents. When you organize those incidents into a plot, the change that occurs is a series of incidents. They happen subsequently. In other words, one after another, after another, after another, after another. When you add the plot and you organize them in a narrative structure, then they're not happening subsequently. They're happening consequently. Mm-hmm. And that's what interests me more, I find, when I'm writing than a 3-act structure. I'm not really thinking of the overall 3-act structure. Stephen was sort of just saying this. You're living it moment by moment, and it's more important that this scene is here because of all the scenes that have preceded it. It's a bit of a paradox. When you do it poorly, critics will say, "Oh, we can see the plot mechanics grinding," or "This is hopelessly contrived." But when you do it well, if it seems natural, then of course it seems like real life. Because in real life, we're all here tonight in the Del Reisman room in the Writers Guild building on 3rd Street on October 4th because of a whole series of choices and decisions that were made in our lives. What if you'd taken that other job instead of the one that you took? What if you went to another college and had a whole different set of college friends? What if you had married someone else? Would you have ended up here tonight, right now? You could be at a medical conference tonight instead of a screenwriting conference. And it's not too late. It's never too late.
No kidding.
Lem is so stoned right now. He is so stoned.
But here's a serious story point. I actually know people who are sorry that they ever made the decision to become a screenwriter. They, had some kind of early encouragement or maybe success. And
can I interrupt you? Do you know somebody who isn't?
No, yes. Well, that's a whole other story. But and that's of course, and if someone feels that way and they bitterly resent the decision they made to go into a very difficult profession that maybe hasn't worked out, and they look back at the fork in the road where they could have gone somewhere else and done something else, that's very sad and depressing in real life. For a movie character, that's fantastic. Yeah. Because you want your character to live with the choices that they've made, for better or for worse, and the decisions from scene to scene to scene. And that's why movies are fantasies, because 9 times out of 10 the character is going to overcome whatever depressing obstacles are thrown in his path. There's a great Joseph Conrad line where he said a man should stand up to his bad choices and his mistakes and his bad luck and his conscience, because what else is there to fight against? So in a movie, I think you need those moment-by-moment experiences and sequences, and have the scenes occur sequentially in that way, and have an accumulation build towards the inevitable ending. So that's why I sort of denigrate the 3-act structure. Not that it's not important overall, but movies are essentially diaristic. It's like that's why they're called movies, because they move relentlessly forward, and you experience them that way. And it's like writing a diary, where it's sort of a voyage of self-discovery towards an unknown outcome, other than the ultimate outcome that awaits us all. You're writing in a state of uncertainty. You're sort of analyzing your day-to-day, moment-by-moment experiences. And that's what happens to movie characters, and that's what happens to the viewer experiencing a movie. Or in theory, that's always what movies were before you could stop them and pause them and, go forward and backwards.
David, you had a thought to follow up on that? Or if not...
Yeah, I could have been a proctologist. Yeah.
I think there's also... yes.
Yeah. Sorry. What is the purpose of a film or a play? In my mind, and again, I'm speaking from a very traditional Western point of view, the purpose is catharsis. You get something from a movie or a play that you don't get in your everyday life. Why is it that kids who have numbed out by countless hours of playing, digital games, so they don't have an emotional life, they go to really scary movies and they love it because they feel something. They feel terror, they feel fear, but they feel an emotion, and that's kind of exciting. So when you go into another form of film, a drama or a comedy, we don't get a lot of laughter in our lives, but a movie that makes us laugh, a movie that makes us cry, a movie that makes us feel triumphant, you've gone through a process, an emotional process. And it seems that the beginning, middle, and end, let's not call it the 3-act structure, it's just the beginning, middle, of an end, is a way of transporting you to that final result of catharsis. You've begun with a problem. You have gone through its exploration, and you've come to a moment of high tension, which is then relieved. And to me, anything that doesn't deliver that catharsis is not being totally successful in dramatic terms.
Mm-hmm. I want to circle back to throwing out 100 pages. Because that's another way of attacking structure. Have you had that experience where you've thrown?
Yeah, I've thrown out 60 pages. When I started writing The King's Speech, I was about 60, 70 pages into it. I showed it to my then wife, who read it. No, that isn't why. That isn't the reason. Nah. Very bright woman, a writer. We had been writing partners for many years, not on everything and clearly not on the King's Speech. She was not my writing partner, but she read it. And in the most diplomatic way she could say this, she said, well, it's got some wonderful things in it, David, but it is diffuse. You're getting seduced by some subplots, and it's not there. It's not focused. And she made a suggestion. She said, why don't you, just as a writing exercise, abandon the screenplay and write it as a play? I mean, this is why I have to defend theater. The physical limitations of the stage will force you to focus on your two main characters, because the King's Speech is, after all, two men in a room. So I did that, and I threw away 60, 70 pages, and it's hard to do. It's, these are your children that you're putting in the ash can. And I wrote it as a play, and I thought, now that's great, and it kind of works. The play then went on to have a life of its own, and some producers picked up on it and said, hey, this would make a really good movie. I said, gee, isn't that a strange thing? And they then paid me to adapt my play back into a screenplay, but it was successful, I believe, because I had gone through the process of throwing out a whole bunch of nicely written stuff that just didn't add up.
Now, it didn't add up because it started before it started? In other words, did it begin before the beginning?
No, it began at the same point, but then it got very diffuse.
Okay.
I went into a subplot of a little boy who was a teacher, who was a client of Logue and who stuttered, and you get all involved with him and his mom, and, it was all lovely stuff. But
I'm so glad you cut that kid.
Yeah.
That
kill
kid,
the kid, right?
Kill him.
Got to kill the kid.
It's a really good choice.
The kid was me.
Sorry, I'm really
I
sorry.
had to kill me.
I would have killed you.
When you threw out 100 pages, was it because it began before the beginning, or was it because of something else?
I've done it so many, maybe not quite that volume, but I've done that process so much. That is my process, is to I often write, and then I realize I'm telling a different story, and and usually what happens to me is I'm writing and it's all just really bad, and then suddenly I'll just have a feeling, I'm like, wow, that's a good scene, I think, and then I'll look at it and I'm like, oh man, that just gives me a whole bunch of new information. I'm rarely enslaved to a story. I don't care what the story is, truthfully. I want scenes and characters that feel just they grab you, and it's just so vivid, and that, like I said, it makes its own weather for me. That's the way I talk about it. And I'll give you specifics though. On Syriana, I wrote reams of stuff, and then I had this Miss America pageant contestant, and a woman I knew said, she was like, those girls, you know exactly what those girls talk like. And she said this one line of dialogue, and I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what they talk about in everything I had written up to that. I'd been working on it for 6 months. Everything was vamping. There wasn't 1 ounce of truth in anything I'd written, and I just knew I had to start again. And I started with that voice, and it was so strong. And then I cut the storyline 3 years later in editing. But I shot it. Then in this most recent thing, it had originally started out, I really wanted to do a spaghetti western, a spaghetti western set in Brooklyn. And that was an idea. That was the Lethal Weapon thing. But really I was saying Lethal Weapon, but really what I wanted to do was a spaghetti western. I forgot to mention that. And I didn't say that in my great pitch. What a genius pitch. Someone should remake Lethal Weapon. You guys are too late. You're late to the party. I thought of it. Woo! But so I was thinking a silent kind of Clint Eastwood kind of dude comes to Brooklyn, and he's a mystery, and there are these two warring crime bosses, and he gets in the middle of all this. I mean, you've seen that movie. It's a Sergio Leone movie. And I started writing them, and I wrote the hell out of this one guy with my friend. Anatoly Gryzlov is the name of the character. Anatoly Gryzlov. He's like a great character. He's not in the movie. And he had 100 pages of really good material. He did scary shit. He was ruthless. He was funny. But that's not what the movie was about. And ultimately, it was only about, one crime boss. And then ultimately, it wasn't even about him. It wasn't about that at all. And that crime boss became a doctor. And and it just kept going. And in the middle of all this, I just want to talk about theme for a second, because something you said earlier reminded me when you said Francis Ford Coppola. He's a talented young man, and I got a letter he gave to Sophia. His old assistant came and worked for me for a while on Syriana that Jim made with me, and he wrote a note to her about things she should know going to make her first movie. And I was like, the sword, the arm comes out of the lake, and it's holding this piece of paper, and I'm going to read it. And number one, he said, always make your days. I'm like, this guy made Apocalypse Now. I've seen that movie. That's bullshit. He's in the jungle for okay. Then number two, learn to nap on set. Mm-hmm. I'm sending the hand back into the water. I don't want Excalibur. But number three, he said, if you feel like you're lost or a scene isn't really working, have the courage to stop what you're doing. Have the courage to walk away, even if it's your most expensive day. Walk away and ask yourself, if this scene had to do nothing except radiate purely off the theme of my movie, what would this scene have to be? And I was like, aha, that's right. And so for me, I agree with the intuitive thing, I'm a mole in the dark, bumping into walls, and sometimes there's an opening and I scurry through it, But as I'm doing all that, there's a musical component to it. There's a musical note that starts to appear in my head, when I'm writing, and I bet it's true for you guys too in your work. And it's different for every film, and it might be or it might be or it might be or it might be you're failing, but no, there's a real and that comes, and that is vibrating right off the theme. And so I'm working, and when I vary too much from it, it's just jarring me, and I'm not logically going, I'm in the middle can't have that scene here. I'm just going, it just feels wrong, And then I think of that thing Francis wrote. I'm like, how do I get back on the theme? And it also, corollary to this is, it usually takes me an enormous amount of writing and a lot of time to actually find my theme. I can articulate my theme up front before I start writing, just like a good student.
Yeah, you can.
Usually, and I'm usually wrong. That's not what it was about. And it takes me a lot of work to get to that.
Yeah, can I just add to that, because I agree with you totally, Steve. I don't think people understand fully that screenwriting is really composition. It's music. Screenplays have their own rhythms, their own contrapuntal rhythms. They have their own melodies. They have side melodies. And if you're listening and if you're in tune with the music of what you're writing, you'll know when you've hit a bad key, when it's off key. And in terms of throwing away pages, I gave an example of throwing away a chunk of pages. But with every script I write, I throw away maybe hundreds of pages, because always, I'll get into a scene too early and I'll get out of it too late. And it's wrong, and you have to chop it off.
So
you have to do
cumulatively,
cumulatively, masses of pages, whole scenes. Oh, that scene just doesn't need to be there. Out it goes. But often, if a scene just isn't working, if you're stuck on a scene, you've either come in too early or too late, or it's the wrong scene. If you really can't make it work, it's usually the wrong scene.
Do you have this experience too, Lem?
Sure. Although when I lose 60 or 70 or 100 pages, I never return to the project. I abandon it. Yeah, no, my favorite quote, my favorite tip of all time is from John Huston. John Huston said that every movie should have a central idea that's like a bell, and every scene in the movie should ring that bell. And when I first read that, I thought, wow, now I can write. But it's true. It's true what Stephen said, that we're not just talking about writing. We're talking about writing for the screen, and movies are a visual medium, and that really takes two forms. It's what you see in the scenes, and a lot of that is direction and staging, but you can write that too. And then there's what you don't see in the in-betweens, in the cuts between from one scene to the next, the juxtaposition of one scene to the next. And a lot of the storytelling in good movies takes place in those cuts. And quite often what happens when your script is ruined by an untalented director is something that you carefully designed in the structure of the scenes. That little bit of storytelling they put in the mouths of the actors as dialogue. You know what I mean? It totally ruins the effect. In other words, it's depriving the audience and the viewer of being able to put two and two together and get it, because you cut from one thing to the next, and the viewer understands what's in the gap. But a lot of the times the people you're collaborating with, and certainly a lot of studio notes, tend to be, let's literally see that. Let's literally have them say that.
What you're saying is it becomes so apparent when you're structuring a multiple narrative, because like if you have 3 or even 4 storylines in one movie, you have way too much. Like it becomes so ruthless, you know. And so when I'm working on an outline, you know, like I may have a macro plan, but as I get into it, I realize I just have way, way too much. And so I start working in these little micro outline chunks where I'm like, I know roughly, you know, when you're writing one storyline, you're in the voice of that world. And you really want to stay in that world when you're in, because it's just like getting into a different movie. You're jumping from one movie to another movie. It's very hard. You know, the characters you leave are like, oh, yeah, you're going to run off with that girl? Yeah, see you, buddy. You know, and then you get to the new one, they're like, where you been? You've been cheating on me, you know, and it's awful. But if you do too much of one, you don't know what amount of concision you need, what amount of story compression, and you don't know what those cuts are going to give you in terms of compression, because you've shot too far out. And you have to be very, very disciplined. And so what I do is I'll work like 3 to 5 scenes out, 3 to 5 scenes out, 3 to 5 scenes out, and I'm looking at them, and of those 3 to 5 scenes out, I realize, because the themes are starting to cross each other, I'm realizing it's giving me that narrative compression. And I mean, that's a fancy way of saying it, but what it means is you can drop 60% of the scenes. You don't need them, you know. And so you don't want to write them and then drop them. You know, you'd rather drop them when you're just thinking about them. But you do that in these little steps, 3 to 5, 3 to 5, 3 to 5, you know, and you're just constantly, and it's really a wonderful way to work, because I believe the thing I love about movies, as opposed to theater, and I like theater. I'm perfect sitting between you guys. I like both very much, and I even like television. I like poetry. But
that's where the real money is.
Yeah. No shit. I'm switching. But what I love in particular about film is that you are such an authoritarian in terms of what the audience gets to see and experience. And, you know, it's not like you're sitting in the audience of a play and, you know, David's gone to all this trouble to, like, make this thing happen over here. And, like, you know, my mom would be like, what's that? What? She's not wearing socks, you know, and it just, in the movie, the camera gives you that. And yet, what I believe about the cut is and it can be the cut in between shots inside of a scene, which is a structure. It can be the cuts in a script between just your declarative sentences of exposition. It can be the pauses that are implicit in the dialogue, where you might want to write a beat, but you don't need to. All of these things, the way the language cuts across each other, all these moments, you offer an opportunity for the audience to bring their inner life to the party, to bring it's silence, it's negative space, and in the best case, you fill in all that turf. So like, whereas I wanted to maybe have 5 scenes in that little section, and I look at these things and I realize, oh my gosh, I only need 2 there and 1 there and 2 there. And in those transitions, hopefully the audience brings their inner life to it and they fill it in. And now it's some other third thing that never existed between your inner life, my artistry, and now there's this other product. And that's what I love about film. Take that, Mr. Theater.
Well,
Fantastic.
sorry. A British director friend of mine told me a story which I think illustrates this point. He was directing Hamlet, and the actor came on in rehearsal, and he went through this whole thing, which I can't do, about 2 minutes of this, and then he started to be, and the director said, "Cut, we're taking that speech out." And the actor said, "But this is the most famous soliloquy in the English language." And the director said, "Yes, but we don't need it now." The soliloquy was Shakespeare's close-up. He didn't have close-ups, and he had a vast audience at a distance, and it all had to be said. But in film, we don't have to say it. We can use the close-up, and we can write the close-up into our script. We can write that moment, and you don't need the screams of, the screeds of dialogue. It's just a completely different art form.
Who's Hamlet again?
I'm going to turn to the audience for questions and ask for good questions right here, but wait for the microphone. It's flying in.
Thank you all for the last couple hours. That was incredible. My question is, the opening question was, where do you start? My question is, where do you end? When do you know if you've ended? Can you ever know if you've ended?
Good question. Anybody want to take that?
Well, if you follow Francis's advice and start by knowing what your end is, then you don't have that problem because you know exactly where you're going, and you have a thin red line. It's the same image as the bell. You have a thin red line that goes right through your script, and everything that serves that thin red line stays in, and whatever, no matter how beautifully it's written, if it doesn't service that thin red line, it goes away because you're heading towards Billings, Montana. And when you get to Billings, Montana, you know the movie's over. But that's a simplistic answer. You feel it in your gut.
It may be simplistic, but it's a damn good answer. Steven?
I like to be surprised in my work, like when I'm working, I just personally like to be surprised. And often the ending that I thought was going to be the ending ultimately isn't the ending for me. A better ending appears. And that can even be in editing, later after you've shot stuff, you see something. But I don't know how long it takes them to do a script, but it takes me a very long time. And like after I've been living in the world of this thing for so long, it starts to have its own rules, and each piece is telling you something different, and I think that often I've been vibrating with a feeling that's very powerful, and I want the movie to leave the audience kind of with that same feeling, and there's many techniques to create a feeling at an ending, and I personally like what I think it was either Hemingway or Fitzgerald called the dying fall, like for me, I just personally like that, not this, which that tests better, by the way. Just I would do that if you have a choice. I don't do that easily, so that's really not an option usually for me, but this really doesn't test well at all. Like, do that at your own peril. Like, electrocute children at your own peril. People don't, that doesn't test. But I like this one that kind of goes like that, because that's what life really, to me, just always feels like, that there's, it's modulated. There's victories and there's defeats, and I like that feeling that it's still going on, that the resolution isn't the only resolution. And so that's a choice that I usually find for everything I'm writing. I usually kind of come at something like that, and that's just a taste thing. And then one last bit about this is I remember so clearly, and it's looking at this carpet that reminded me. I used to have a rental house, and I had carpet like this in it, and I never liked the last third of my script for Syriana. Like, I just didn't like the way it was working exactly, and so I got out the note cards, and I had, I think, 270 scenes, which is a lot for a film, and I put them all out, and the board wasn't big enough, so then I had them on the floor of this living room of this rental house, and I was living alone, and I got on my hands and knees, and I started crawling around, and I was crawling around, moving those cards around, and moving them around, and moving them around, and I spent so much time on my knees that I got permanent cottage cheese marks in my knee they would never go away. If I was like in the shower, I'd be like, oh my God, I have leprosy. But it was just, oh right, I'm trying to figure out the ending of this movie. It went on and on and on. And then I had the idea of killing the suicide bombers and having them speaking from beyond the grave, and then I knew that was going to be a voiceover over all these, and suddenly all this mass of stuff that wasn't really fitting in there, I knew it was all going to be visual. And those scenes were all just going to be brushstrokes, brushstroke, brushstroke, brushstroke. But you'd be living with the guy who was already dead. And that came so late in the process, but I was so grateful. And it popped into my head. I was sound asleep. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and I woke up and I was like, that's a stupid idea. Oh my God, that's the idea, Right back to the living room, to the cards, in the dark.
I always think, every really good movie is a character study. And I think you come to the end when the character comes to the end of his quest, or voyage of self-discovery, or achieves some kind of realization that's going to allow him to live his life beyond the movie. Because a movie has to be about the most important thing that ever happened to this person. That's the weakness of episodic television, because next week they're going to have an equally exciting adventure or experience. And it's the trouble with sequels, because how do you continue a really satisfying, the whole point of a really satisfying movie that's a hit is that it told a story that had a resolution, and a sequel is always lesser. Dirty Harry is a great character study. It's a fantastic cop chasing a killer movie, but it's primarily a great character study. That's why it's called Dirty Harry. And it ends with him throwing away his badge. He comes to some kind of a conclusion, and then when you have a sequel, it's like, we were just kidding. He's not really going to throw away his badge. Even a movie that you would think would be a high concept one-liner, just gimmicky situation, if it's good, if it turns into a phenomenon, it's because it's a character study, like Planet of the Apes. Planet of the Apes is a movie that, by any regular Hollywood standard or measure, would have been a one-off, would have been a cheesy science fiction film with a stolid, astronaut hero. I think Charlton Heston was a kind of an underrated movie star, and that movie is a great character study of this character named Taylor. You could almost call that movie Taylor. And it ends with an incredibly famous, legendary ending, which works on two levels. It works on the level of an incredible plot twist, surprise. But it also ends with Charlton Heston, dropping to his knees on that beach and just, that primal cry of, damn you, God, damn you all to hell. It's a very unusual character in a movie, in a Hollywood major studio movie. It's a very unusual character for a movie star to play, because this guy is a nasty, cynical, mean misanthrope. And the ending of that movie is set up from the very beginning. I said that movies are diaristic. It starts with Charlton Heston speaking into a microphone, like recording the ship's log of his spaceship. But That movie is about that character's journey. And I'll demolish another myth of writing, which is that the essence of drama is character change. I think what that really means in a lot of good movies is the character changes after the movie is over. The movie has been the experience that has changed him. You don't necessarily have to see character change in the movie, as long as you feel it at the end. And I grew up. My idol was Steve McQueen. Why would you want Steve McQueen to be any different at the end of the movie than he was at the beginning? You want him to be Steve McQueen. He's your idol. You want to be Steve McQueen. So I don't think Steve McQueen at the end of The Great Escape or Bullet is any different than he was at the beginning. But I'm trusting that the filmmakers, the writer, the director, are showing me the most exciting thing that ever happened to him. That the whole rest of his life, nothing is going to equal that moment of being on that motorcycle and jumping over that fence in his crazy bid for freedom. That's the moment that character himself will look back on as, boy, that was the high point of my life. Nothing can top that. That's how you get to the end. Your character takes you there.
And Ally McGraw in 71.
And that too.
Yeah. I think that one of the undisclosed secrets of the three of us is this. And I can say this in Southern California. I couldn't say this in London. This is too woo-woo. But when you get deep enough into a project and you know your characters well enough, a very strange thing happens. Tell me if this does not happen with you, that you cease to be a writer and you become a stenographer. And they just tell you what they want you to be doing. They tell you what they're going to say, and they'll say, and now I'm going to do this. And you think, wait, that's not on the 3x5 card. I didn't plot that. Why am I suddenly having this person do that? They want to do it. And you better listen to them. It's a very strange and wonderful, it's a very wonderful feeling that happens when that creative, I don't know what it is, a force field takes over, and you're just you're on automatic pilot.
Do you have the same experience?
I just I just wanted to say that one of the really important, like, just to agree completely, is that you have to be open to that, because often you're telling yourself, I'm doing this thing and it's this and it's going to be this, and suddenly you realize, when you're lucky, like, it really is just coming right through you, and it can be something wildly different, and you have to really be open to it and have the courage to let go of the thing, because often you hold on really tight. And I wanted to tell one little last story that is burnishes this idea a little bit, but it happened to me directly, and it was kind of cool. I wrote a movie with Michael Tolkien, a spec called 20 Billion, and it was really, I learned a lot from Michael. He did an incredible job. He was going to direct it. We had a movie star, Paramount, and Sidney Pollack was producing it, and Sidney's the master craftsman. And so the movie star comes in and takes a meeting, and we're sitting at a conference table, and he's like, it's the 25-25-25-25 rule. And basically after that, blah, 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 blah. And Sidney's like, what? He's like, well, every 25 pages, the movie has to, like, totally change and do something different. Otherwise it's the butts in the seats rule. He's like, what? And he goes, the butts will start squirming in the seats. The butts will start squirming in the seats, right? And the people are bored. And, like, if you've done 2 25s, it has to change this way. And, like, so he goes on this thing, and while he's talking, Sidney's sitting at the end of the table, and he's got his feet up on the conference table now, and he's doing this. And the guy starts getting really uncomfortable. And he's like, oh, shit, look at me. I'm lecturing Sidney Pollack on structure. Whoa, whoa, whoa. And Sidney's like, he goes, no. I think what you're saying is wonderful. I'm just realizing I won 9 Academy Awards for a movie with 7 acts, 7 quarters. No, I won 9 Academy Awards for a movie with 7 quarters. And I don't know quite how the math adds up.
Brilliant.
It was just, there's these rules, and like I think from all of us, you get, how we go about it is slightly differently and slightly the same. But when that muse is talking to you, the rules go out the window.
One of the things that the Writers Guild Foundation, I think, rightly takes great pride in is that these sessions, the Notes on Craft, and we also do Writers on Genre, which you guys have contributed to in the past, seek to demystify screenwriting as much as possible. And the gurus try and mystify it, try and make it some, every 25 pages you've got to do this. Every, what was the other thing? Every 25 pages?
Butts in the seat rule.
Butts in the seat rule.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, those rules are for people that aren't writers.
Yeah.
When writing something that is either a theme or a scene that is rather pretentious, is that determined by you, or is that determined by an elected group of peers? When you are writing something and you think it's too much.
Yes, it's determined by the people you're working with.
I mean, I can be so pretentious. I mean, it's like...
Vu?
But not you, David. No way. But it's a kind of thing, like, I think I have a, I'm lucky. I have a guy who is my best friend, and we've known each other for our whole lives practically, and we both turned out to be writers. He's a novelist, and we wrote this latest screenplay together. He's an incredible editor, and he's also a real regular guy, and he is the enemy of anything that smacks of pretense, and so I've spent my whole life defending every scene against one person who hates that more than anything. So I've had whole decades arguing, pretense is the bedrock of evolution. I am going to write Hamlet. That's my next project. And he's just like, you sound like such an ass. And so it's an interesting question. I really do think that a lot of stuff that comes to you, you have to be aware of your inner editor, that your inner editor can use words like pretentious, or it can use words like, full of shit, or like, you have there's ways your inner editor can just tar stuff, that maybe needs to be looked at a second, again and again, that can be a new direction in your art, you're going a new direction. And at first it smells funny, but you're out there and you're taking risks, and take that, Shannon Burke.
Thank you. Right here.
Okay. I talk to my characters, and they talk to me, but they don't do anything. I have a difficult time with story, with plot, and that's why I came tonight. Is there something I can say to my characters that can get them to move?
You're fired.
Yeah. Stuff has to happen, man. It's like, the best, the best thing you can do in reading your own stuff is to look at it and be really honest with whether or not you're boring yourself. Period. And drama is, it's usually a protagonist and an antagonist. The protagonist wants something, the antagonist is trying to stop them, and that creates incredible friction. you got to put your characters in enormous conflict with one another, you know? Usually. Make them do stuff to each other, like prima facie. Kill each other, rape each other, cheat on each other, lie to each other, pull guns, don't use them, streak, burn down houses. What else? Am I leaving anything out?
The most important thing, I would say the most important thing, if I had to give you one piece of advice above all others, perhaps, it's that the situation has to come out of the character, not the other way around. That when you go to a movie, or people go to a movie, maybe a comedy movie, and they come out and they say, oh, it's sitcom-y. You know, the term sitcom is a term of, is a pejorative. It's not good if something is sitcom-y. The best sitcoms are about character. There's not a particularly high concept situation in, you know, whatever the great top 10 sitcoms are, the Mary Tyler Moore Show, or what's Taxi? The Taxi is just a bunch of guys in a garage. Or Cheers, people in a bar. It's the people that matter. And the way you get your character moving is if he's forced to. And the situation comes out of that. It's sort of what I was saying about Charlton Heston in the original Planet of the Apes. Or MASH. I mean, MASH seems like it's a situation. Let's make a movie about a mobile army surgical hospital. But then accidentally they got Robert Altman to direct it. They didn't know he was Robert Altman then. He was a guy in his 40s who'd been directing television and had no, you know, he was cheap. And proper directors had turned it down. And they accidentally got Robert Altman, who doesn't really care about scripts or structure or any of that. He cares about people and putting real people in that setting. Movies now, the main reason they're terrible by most people's common agreement, most movies now are terrible, is because they're strictly situational and characters are dropped in, you know, cardboard cutout comic book characters. If you can somehow reverse that in anything you're writing and make the situation come out of the character, then that's everything.
You know, drama comes from conflict. So the first thing you have to ask is, what does your lead character want? And once you know what they want, because if they don't want anything, then they're not worth writing about. But if they want something, then the rest is relatively easy, because all you need is a character who wants the opposite. Or maybe it's not a character. Maybe it's just force of nature. Maybe it's a farmer who wants the beautiful crop. And guess what? The locusts are coming, or the hurricane is coming. Something is in conflict, and that's drama. And then you don't have nothing happening.
You know, and I would just say, you know, I actually arrived in Hollywood to be a screenwriter, and I was here for a while before I ever actually really heard the terms protagonist and antagonist, which is very strange, right? I mean, think about that. Like, and I'd written an early script, and this friend of mine said to me, it was like, and he'd gone to Brown, he was a very smart guy. He said, "You need an antagonist." And I was like, huh? Why? You know, I thought the hero could be both, and maybe sometimes, but you know, don't overlook those building blocks that, you know, the Greeks gave us to torture us.
Right there.
Mr. Dobbs, you were talking about kind of a new way of looking at the 3-act structure, and while you were doing that, you were talking about a patient and a medical show and a detective show. The problem is, while you were doing that, something that these two guys inspired just solved all my problems in my latest script, and so I was writing that down feverishly, and I missed that. So I'll get rid of this thing right now, but if you could just reiterate that in like 10 words, I'll shut up. Like, what were the 3 terms you used?
The 3 terms I used were, first part is speculation, something speculative, a question. And the second part is the interpretation of that question, or the investigation. And the final part is the discovery, or the answer. So it is like, you know, it's why Robert Towne wrote a detective movie. Actually, when he wrote Chinatown, he thought, I want to direct a movie, and I'll write a detective movie, because no matter how bad the direction is, no matter how many mistakes I make as a first-time director, at least if I have a detective following clues along the way, people will be interested in that. And so the detective film fits that formula, as well as anything, as well as the courtroom story or the medical story. It starts with, find the girl. But over the course of the movie, usually what happens in the great detective movies is the detective finds himself. That was even the line on a poster of, I think, almost the equivalent of Chinatown Night Moves, made in the same era. The line on the poster is, maybe he would find the girl, maybe he would find himself. And I thought, and that's great, because that's the two things. That's the plot, and it's the character. And the situation comes out of the character. In finding the girl, he's going to find out some truth about himself and his own relationships.
Great. Right here.
So you were talking about the two-act structure. So it reminds me of India, where I'm from, where actually the movies will have interval, and the movies will be before interval and then after the interval. Because if you don't hold the audience before the interval, then they will leave in the interval. They will never come back. And then they'll tell their friends and people waiting outside to buy the tickets, don't go watch this movie, it sucks. So when you were talking about this, it totally fit into that bill, because I remember many movies we used to watch till interval and say, oh shit, man, let's go. And I remember there were some movies which used to be really amazing after interval. So that's, but now, Western style, India is becoming like a 3-act structure, and the movies are becoming shorter, 90 minutes, and so is that what you're talking about, the 2-act structure?
Absolutely, because I grew up at a time when the movies I love more than any other kind of movie, and to this day are the movies that had intermissions, which is a lost part of the thrill of going to the movie.
Some of the great Western movies, Lawrence of Arabia had an interval. Sound of Music had an interval.
Yeah, all those big blockbuster movies of my youth and childhood had a very dramatic midpoint, and the music would build to that moment, and and then it would stop.
Gone with the Wind famously had, an intermission.
I mean, but in television, I mean, you're constantly working for it's changing, but you're always working for the commercial break, so you're always working in a 4-act structure, so now it's a 5-act structure to fit more commercials in, and
sadly 6 now.
6, there you go. Next year, 7. But it's the same exact idea, because they're like, oh man, now we're gonna sell them something, and we want them to come back so we can sell them more shit later. So you're always,
Yeah, I mean, I grew up for a while in England, where very similar. Every movie had an intermission, whether it was designed that way or not. They just chopped it right in the middle, so the tea ladies could bring you nice cups of tea, and you could have ice creams, right? You always had your tub of ice cream. The whole thing of making the 90-minute movie is also a commercial consideration. They want more showings so they can sell more popcorn, because that's where they're making their money, is on the popcorn and Pepsi-Cola and Coca-Cola sales. But I distinctly remember that. The fact that the ones that worked were designed for that intermission tells you something about structure, about how it should work. Yeah.
I have 3 pretty young kids, and I was always showing them pretty advanced, whatever, just the movies I liked, because I just couldn't. I hate Lion King and whatever. So yeah, sorry.
It was a play.
Oh my God, it was a play.
It became a play after a movie.
That's right. So I'd show them Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
But I remember showing them Lawrence of Arabia when they were 5 and 7 or something, and we got to that intermission, the card and the music, and it was so they just could. What happened? It's broken. Where's the rest of it? Your daddy, what's wrong here? I was like, this is where we make milkshakes. I love the intermission.
Probably one of the greatest intermission breaks was Dr. Zhivago. Do you remember? And the train comes thundering out of the... Oh, you've got to stay to see the second half of that.
Yeah.
Daddy, what was the whipping? what was that about?
I'll tell you something really funny. I showed, after Lawrence of Arabia, my daughter fell asleep in all the movies, but my son was very into it, and we watched Hidden Fortress and we watched Seven Samurai, and we got to the end of Seven Samurai, and he said, Dad, I really like that movie. I think that's probably a great movie. It's better than Hidden Fortress. It's almost as good as Iron Giant.
Right.
And he's not wrong. I mean, Iron Giant's a great film.
Great. I'm looking to this side of the room, right here in the back.
Hi. I'm not a screenwriter, but I am a writer. And as a viewer, I've often been pulled out of a film due to excessive exposition, and I'm wondering how you handle that as writers. How do you anyway, I'll turn it over to you. That's my question.
Not in one of my films.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think, but I mean, I fight it like tooth and nail, like a wildcat. I mean, I fight it. Like, I hate explaining. Like, I mean, you gotta trust the audience. You gotta let people, even if, let them be lost. Let them bring that inner life, And I mean, I'm telling you, exposition is the enemy. It's the enemy of drama. Like nine times out of 10, Like when dialogue is really good, like you don't even need exposition. You don't need a parenthetical like shrugs, or whatever. Like it's carried, and like in good writing, it's always carried. And the subtext is destroyed by explaining, and actors can't play it. If you wrote screenplays the way most executives actually want to read screenplays, they would be uncastable because no actor would ever play them, ever. So you have to literally often write multiple scripts. You write a script is going to go to the actor. You write a script that's going to go to the green light committee so they can like get their mind around it, and then you're just going to pull that shit out of it because like the actor would look at it and be like, this sucks.
Yeah. Well, famously, studio executives. This is the point where one time during each panel, if you've been here before, I insert myself as a panelist instead of a moderator, and this is my time to do it. The studios read scripts. They just read what they choose to read. They'll either read the dialogue only and not, so you have to put an underline, this character dies. Otherwise you'll get a note, what happened to Joe? He kind of just disappeared from the story. Yeah, he was killed, on page 76. Oh, really? Oh, well, we should, you should show that. Well, okay. But of course, this is totally pejorative, but famously, actors read, the way an actor reads a script is bullshit, my line. Bullshit, my line. Anyway, sorry.
But I believe actors, like great actors, what they do is they extract subtext that's been written, and it's it's there, but it's magical. It's not really said, It's something that happens, but it's there to be extracted. And when it's over enunciated,
exposition is an abomination. It really is. And good writing, good screenwriting is always the tip of the iceberg. It's the little tips of the iceberg. And Steve says, a really good actor knows that there's this huge block of ice underneath, and they'll find it and they'll mine it. You don't need to put it up there.
Well, that's the oldest theatrical actor's joke. If you ask an actor who's in a play, who comes on in one scene at the beginning without any lines at all, and he's the butler, and if you ask that guy what's the play about, he'll say, "Oh, it's about a butler who comes and has to lay out this lavish meal while this family drama is going on."
These two ambulance attendants take a crazy woman to the hospital. Streetcar named Desire, right?
That's true. I think the easiest trick, I suppose, to deal with exposition is to have your character, your protagonist, be an outsider, and have the outsider enter some world, because then they bring the audience with them, and you can explain anything you want because they're an outsider, especially if they're a journalist. You can play tricks like that. In fact, I was thinking, I'll make you a panelist. I was thinking about Dan on the way here because we've never met until tonight. And when I did teach my class at USC once, one evening I devoted to Sidney Poitier, because I thought he's a very clear example of an outsider figure. And he made that movie time and time and time and time again. Or maybe Hollywood used him for that purpose, because of course he had a kind of an outsider quality because of his unique circumstances anyway, being the first African-American movie star. And it shows you how movies are really basically the same. All movies are basically the same, no matter what the subject matter is. So Sidney Poitier could play a journalist who's dropped onto a nuclear battleship and gets into a conflict with the authoritarian, tough military commanding officer while they're hunting a Russian sub. Or Sidney Poitier could be a roving, itinerant handyman construction guy who finds himself dropped into this little enclave of nuns, of German nuns, and they get him to build a chapel for them. And he gets into it, and the conflict is between him and the authority figure of this little world, the mother superior of these nuns. Or Sidney Poitier, most famously, he's an urban, big city police officer in a little redneck southern town, and he gets into it with the local authority figure who's the bigoted chief of police. So, or in Dan's movie, he's similar. He's a big city policeman who's dropped into the wilderness.
CIA agent in the wilderness.
CIA agent, and he gets into it with the local guy who's the expert on that world, the trapper, hunter, tracker guy. So you have two stories going on. You have whatever the interesting hunt for a killer movie is, or the murder mystery, or a riveting edge of your seat nuclear submarine cat and mouse story, or a nice humane story about a gentle story about a group of nuns. But Sidney Poitier is the same in every movie. It's the same story of him entering this world, and through that character and through his eyes, you can learn everything you want to know about how a nuclear battleship works, and who all the personnel are, and what their different jobs are, and what it's like being a doctor on that ship, and what the commanding officer is like, because it's seen through the eyes of this journalist who's taking notes.
Great movie, The Bedford Incident.
The exposition is like one of these things. You ultimately you will have to do it, at some point in some way, and that's a device. There's 50 devices, that can work out of the story or out of, a job interview. Have them interview the character. In every spy movie now, it's a mystery person, but now they're going to explain, and you have the clear glass screens. It turns out he was in deep cover, so on, and then, but when in doubt, go back to Orson Welles, and just do news on the march. It works great. Citizen Kane, he stops the damn movie for like 7 minutes and runs a newsreel to fill you in on everything you might be wondering. News on the march.
Yeah, no, that's another great device. One of my favorite movies is Patton. And when you have it's very difficult to do a biographical film about someone, about when years go by. And it's, again, a very useful trick to just face the elephant in the room. Just have a newsreel, filling in the gaps between military campaigns. My upcoming film is about the Weather Underground, the radical activist group in the 60s. Now, a lot of people nowadays aren't going to know that. So the movie starts off with, news reports. So it brings, but the main thing is to do it up front, I think. If you get it out of the way up front, that was Hitchcock's technique always. He would always have a very boring scene up. Sometimes he had it at the end, actually, but he tried to have it up front. Give the audience everything they need to know in an incredibly boring scene up front, then they can relax and enjoy the movie.
That's much better than like trying to like finagle it into dialogue where characters are telling each other things they should know about each other already.
One of the famous Hitchcock devices was he had North by Northwest. Leo G. Carroll,
He has the Star Chamber.
who is the who's the CIA, or he says I'm all part of that alphabet soup. CIA, FBI, whatever figure, walking with Cary Grant across an airport. And he explains to Cary Grant everything that's been going on to Cary Grant's character during the movie. But we don't hear it because the plane in the foreground or the background, I forgot which, just revs its propellers in those days, and we don't hear it. We just see the conversation, and we kind of know, we kind of okay, he gets it now, and he's explained that he's a spy and all of that.
There was always Leonard the Explainer.
Yeah,
Right? There was always a character.
Irvin the Explainer, Morris the Explainer.
Right. There's a wonderful place in London, the National Film Theatre, which we should actually have here in L.A., where they, in repertory, just play some of the great movies of all time. And I went to see one of my favorite old Hollywood movies, Sand Pebbles, a Steve McQueen movie, which is a great movie. Also has an intermission, by the way, and it holds up. You could say you could release that movie today, and it would look absolutely modern, except for an early scene where they sit around explaining the political situation in China at that moment. And it's deadly. I mean, it's 10 minutes of dead space, and then the movie begins. And if you cut that scene, I'm sure the audience wouldn't miss it at all and would love it.
Yeah. All right. This is the time of the evening where I have to ask for a great last question. Okay, you've got a great last question.
How would you say that you overcome your fundamental darkness as a writer, and also in the process of writing a screenplay and in your life? Boom.
The fundamental darkness of your...
The best way, the most effective way is if you're writing for someone else and they've paid you money and you have to do it. When I'm left to my own devices, abandonment is the easier option.
And drugs.
Yeah. Actually, Lynn, that's very accurate. There is something about being paid that validates the process. And for those of us who cannot imagine an audience being interested in us and our story, that's a very important thing. Somebody has said, yeah, I will pay you to write this. I think it's got value. And suddenly you think, yeah, it's got value. But if left to your own devices, yeah, it's drugs and alcohol and, anything else that goes.
I mean, I think, like I always say this dumb thing, I say, God loves a deadline. And I think deadlines are really important. I mean, it's like I fight them, I hate them, but, you just, and often money comes with that and creates that structure, which I think definitely helps. But like the writing process for me is ultimately is quite cathartic. It's I have a very hard time doing it. It's quite painful often, for whatever reason. Not like heroic. It just is really hard to do. I put too much pressure. I get stuck. I have writer's block or whatever you call it. I write, then I don't have writer's block, but I write really badly forever, and it's appalling. And I but when it 365, I work every day practically, and of that 365 days, and I work like in last year I knew I worked August 19th to June 26th every day, including Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving, Christmas Eve, every single day. It's crazy, right? And of those days, I probably had maybe spread out in 2 or 3 occasions, maybe like 12 really good hours. And they were insanely good. They were very prolific. They were magical. They were so much better than I could do. Steve sitting here, I don't know where they came from or why or how, But it's so good that little bit of time and all that hard effort, which was awful, is good enough that I'm psyched to do it again this year, But I don't have any illusions. I don't think I'm going to wake up and just be whistling zippity-doo-dah out of orifices and off to I have no expectations. I'm living for that few hours where all that hard work suddenly coalesces and it's crystal clarity. I know exactly what to do. That horse is running for the barn, and I do months of work in a day.
Let's face it, writing is a profoundly lonely profession, even if you work with a partner. But if you don't work with a partner, it's even more profoundly lonely, because it's one of the few professions where you must sit in a room by yourself and confront yourself. And that's scary. That's why a lot of writers are delighted at the thought of being writers. That's great. But the actual process of writing is something that they don't like doing very much, because it really is terrifying. You're by yourself. You have to create order out of chaos, or possibly not order out of chaos. Maybe you just create chaos, which has its own beauty, as in Steve's movies, and they are wonderful. No, I'm saying this as a profound compliment, but it's being by yourself and just looking into the mirror, and who do you see there?
Yeah, you do have to be a bit of a narcissist, I think, to get beyond your doubts. I mean, I think the main thing is not to second guess yourself and not to let thoughts intrude on what you're doing about, will anybody like this? Is there a market for this? They don't make movies like this anymore. Or if you write what you really want to write and you shut out all the other noise, which is very difficult, and you shut out fashion and trends and contemporary ideas about things, just focus on what you think is interesting, then I think you get through it.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much. This has been the most extraordinary panel. David, Stephen, Lem, thank you. Thank you all on behalf of the Writers Guild Foundation for coming, and I hope to see you. I won't be here in 2 weeks, but I'll be here next week, and then for the conclusion of the notes on craft. Thank you.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you. That is so inspiring. Thank you.
Folks, just put your surveys on the table outside, if you would. If you filled them out, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This is my first event. I can't wait to come. Oh, great. Thank you. It was amazing. Oh, super. Thank you. Absolutely. Yeah, we're all three of us. Yes. Very cool. I actually found out about this through the USC website, so we're promoting it. Great. Yeah. You know Lem from there? I'm just a director. Hi. We're 3 USC film students. Thank you so much. Really great.
I'm critical studies. Production. I'm also a production major.